Can everybody hear me? Hey, Peter. Dr. Marks, how are you? Can you hear me? I don't think we're getting Dr. Marks' audio yet.
Now you will.
Excellent.
It does, even at this point in the pandemic, it does help to unmute.
There you go. Dr. Marks, you're leaving me quite exposed here. I'm sitting all by myself, so next time we're going to hopefully get you here in person. But thank you very much for joining us again for a second time at the World Medical Innovation Forum, focused again, like last year, on a topic that your agency has been particularly busy with, genetic medicine. And you've been quite public about us having a particular interest as well. Maybe just as an icebreaker, can you share with us kind of what drives that personal interest and how that is implemented in the agency?
Yeah, so, I think we've seen the potential successes of gene therapy. As from the time I was a resident and fellow in the Brigham system, just around the time Partners, which is no longer Partners, but just around that time it was formed, gene therapy, we were right on the cusp of gene therapy. We were right on the cusp for a number of years. We had some setbacks. And now we're starting to really see what this can do and how versatile it can actually potentially be from a variety of different approaches, how we can use cell-based gene therapies, directly administered gene therapies. And I think there are so many ways that things may evolve with both viral vectors, non-viral vectors, a tremendous amount of opportunity for innovation here to potentially give more permanent fixes, if not permanent fixes, longer term fixes than we're currently able to do, and to transform diseases from ones that take people's lives into ones that become conditions that we can address and either essentially are gone entirely or else become diseases that people can live with. So I think we have a lot of room for growth here. I think we're still early on. What excites me is we're not in a mature field. We've probably just started to be able to stand, right? We're able to stand and take a few baby steps, but it would really be nice to see the field progress now and start to get on to. And I'm hoping in the rest of my career to see us get from toddling to adolescence, and so it would be nice over the next years to see that move along.
Thanks for sharing that, and we'll talk much more about the maturity of the field, or perhaps the lack thereof. But maybe first, I wanted to kind of inquire about the agency, kind of the workload at the agency, the morale, particularly after this period of unprecedented stress that the world is under, right? Pandemics, war, volatile markets, and then on top of that, the agency having been such a central player in the COVID crisis. Now that we're somewhat, hopefully, emerging from this phase, at least, how has the agency and its people come out of this time? And perhaps for developers here in the audience, both on the academic and the industry side, maybe a few pointers or suggestions in terms of how to optimally, in this era, interact with the agency and respecting, obviously, the stress that you remain to be under.
There are lots of things to unpack there. I think right now, obviously, the workload that came during the pandemic for our cell and gene therapy branches was very significant. That workload was so significant because we had a continued number of INDs in the gene therapy space that were going on. Submissions continued to come in. And then we had a bolus of submissions in the cell-based therapy end of things for therapies related to COVID-19. There were other therapeutics related to COVID-19 that fell into our side of the biologics house. And that really kept people very busy. And that came on top of a situation where going into the pandemic, we were understaffed. We were probably 50% understaffed going into the pandemic. And so we remain very understaffed from my perspective. So where we are right now is in a place where we are much more limited than I would ever like to be in our ability to respond to sponsors in a timely manner. I don't feel our current level of service is acceptable, that we have to transform our organization to be able to have the kind of interaction that we really need to bring these therapies forward. What do I mean by that? As although people say I may be dealing with gene and cell therapies today, during the pandemic I've dealt a lot with vaccines, and in that vaccine realm, if there's anything I've witnessed, it's how much progress we can make when we're able to have more continuous dialogue, more informal dialogue with sponsors. And I absolutely am convinced that that would be crucial to moving the gene therapy field forward, to propelling it forward in a way that we're not doing so right now. Now, we've been limited in those interactions by our staffing issues of not having enough staff. The good news is, as we move into the next user fee agreement, it looks like we will staff up significantly. And we will make up that staffing deficit. Not that we will be perfect, but at least we will be able to, over the course of a few years, hire enough people so that some of what we'd like to see happen can happen. One of the things that has come from the pandemic that may well help us is that before the pandemic, it would have been very hard for you to get me to agree to having reviewers to be located, I don't know, in San Francisco or in Chicago. But now we've proven to ourselves after 2 years that we can work virtually with, as long as we have highly motivated, highly qualified people and the best individuals who are committed to working on this field. Doesn't matter where they're located in the United States, we will be able to make use of their expertise, and that should hopefully help us to staff up more quickly than we would have otherwise. So bottom line is, I think for sponsors, their inclination of sponsors that interaction with the agency is important is the correct inclination. It is that intuition is correct. Yeah. It is my desire that we try to facilitate that, but to get to the levels that we really would like to get to, we're going to still have to staff up some. So I'm going to beg people's indulgence in the delays right now, because I know there are way too many written response onlys going out. Yep. Rather than the interactive dialogue.
Got it. So the FDA is going remote, is what I hear.
We're not going fully remote. I mean, I still like my office. We still have people that like to see each other. But I think we've come to realize that if we want the best talent, we're going to have to be competitive with other biotechnology organizations. Yep. And just so people know, your companies may have do competitive intelligence. I do my own competitive intelligence. I don't have quite a big budget for it, but on a $0 budget, you actually can do enough networking to find out that if a lot of gene therapy companies are allowing this to happen, we have to let it happen as well, or else, rather than actually attracting people, we're going to have people poached. And so we're having to adapt to that. I think that at least for the next few years, we're going to see how this all settles out. I don't think we're going to know for sure how this experiment in virtual work all ends. until we have some more experience with it. But I'm willing to be part of that experiment right now, because unless we are part of it, we won't be able to have the kind of talent around that we need to give the kinds of advice to sponsors that's actually going to be meaningful and useful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I mean, best of luck with that, because I think your success is going to be ultimately the success of the industry, right? So you're at such a juncture. So thanks for applying the creativity to make do with the current situation. You touched on innovation, regulatory innovation, and lessons learned out of warp speed and the vaccines development. There's another effort that I'm aware of within the cell and gene therapy sector, at least specifically on the gene therapy sector, the Bespoke program, which I know you personally had a significant role in terms of championing. Can you maybe just touch a little bit and talk to this audience about these two efforts, kind of the lessons learned, how they came to be, particularly on the Bespoke side of things, whether there's any parallels there that you see, and whether we can expect more of these kind of innovative ideas from the agency?
Yeah, so the Bespoke Therapeutics grew up out of some interactions that we had with folks at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, and from interactions that we were having with sponsors, both at academic institutions and at small companies, and trying to find a way to get over a problem. So what was the problem? The problem is that many gene therapies are targeted for small populations. And even gene therapies that are targeted for somewhat larger populations, when you think about, as we move into the era of genome editing, they break down into sets of gene therapies, different constructs, each one for a relatively small population. And so addressing this issue of gene therapies for small populations became more and more of an interest of mine. And then the question was, how do you start to solve this? And what were the real problems? Well, there are issues, obviously, in non-clinical development, in clinical development, in access after the fact. But one of the really important issues, there are tremendous issues in manufacturing. And the problem is that right now, you have to have something, if you're gonna have something be successful, it has to be able to happen in an affordable way that ultimately makes it both affordable to investigate, and then has some type of commercial model that might support a growth system so that people will want to produce the therapies and build businesses off of them. And so the Bespoke Therapeutics model, or individualized therapeutics model, the idea here is it could be N of one, but more likely we're for gene therapies, it's probably the number of people are in the dozens, not the hundreds or thousands. Yeah, I guess maybe the hundreds could be the upper limit, but we're talking about gene therapies that might treat dozens of people per year. Yeah. And right now, those people are not well served by the current framework that we have, because it's very expensive to do the setup to manufacture runs that might treat 10 or 20 people a year, and to do that sustainably. Maybe you can do one run, but then next year, what's going to happen? And part of that is that we realize that a lot of the innovation comes out of academic institutions. The academics either produce the gene therapy using small scale methods, adherent cell culture, or maybe roller bottles. And then they make enough, they're often sometimes able to even show that the gene therapy works or appears to work. But then they go to transfer the methodology, and it's very challenging to transfer to a commercial source, either a contract manufacturer or to a partner who has acquired or licensed the asset. So the idea here was to think about how can we start to make this happen in a more facile manner. And so the two pieces of this, and the two key components, component one was, could you develop kind of a cookbook so that when an academic goes to do this, or even a small company starts to produce their gene therapy, they can use a protocol that is tried and tested for transferring to contract manufacturers. And so basically, it's a little bit like where we all finally settled at one point on using VHS recorders. You know, originally there was Betamax and VHS recorders, and everyone moved to one. Having standards in the electrical industry is really important. And it's trying to get to essentially a standard here that could facilitate things. So that's part one. Part two is figuring out how we could reduce some of the regulatory burden and other burdens that are actually making this more challenging. And to me, some of this is taking advantage of something that's inherent in gene therapy. Gene therapies are somewhat different than many of the other products that we deal with because they do have a little bit of a device flavor to them. The backbone of the vector is something that is reusable much the same way like a scalpel handle is reusable. Now, you can't put any blade on any scalpel. We know that, right? You can't put any old insert into any vector. But on the other hand, you could imagine that you could have a vector which could accept a variety of inserts because it's well characterized to do so. And instead of having to go back to FDA every time you need to do this with toxicology information and manufacturing information, that if we could get it right, maybe we could start to use right of reference. And when you went from, let's just make up something, when you went from treating MPS 3 to MPS 6, you, instead of going through the whole rigmarole again of toxicology and manufacturing information, if the inserts were such that you could move from one to another in a vector system, you might be able then to use right of reference to the well characterized. And so that's the idea of this bespoke therapeutics pathway. There is a consortium now that is being run out of the Foundation for National Institutes of Health, the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium, that is working to try to make this into a reality, to develop that cookbook and to facilitate some test cases. Because ultimately, to me, unless we find a way to make this commercially viable by reducing the cost and decreasing some of the regulatory burden, we're not going to do service to patients. You could say, well, can't nonprofits make this happen? In my experience, nonprofits can make it happen for a few diseases, but we have literally hundreds or thousands of rare genetic diseases that might be approachable like this, so that's not going to get it there. The additional problem is that if you believe truly in the equity, the equality that we should have with gene therapy of serving all different populations, nonprofits tend to, just as a matter of course, they tend to underserve some populations. So the commercial, it's a very, I love this. This would be a great philosophic talk to have sometime because it's paradoxical to me that private industry, right?
Or more democratic somehow.
More democratic than nonprofits here.
But you're two of the common threads here that you comment on are platforms and sharing, right? Information sharing or getting to kind of the drug master file-like approach that you're commenting on. And actually just in this morning's session, and we only just started with this forum, those are two of the elements that have continuously come back on the panels, right? That ultimately this particular field, because of some of the intricacies and complexities around cell and gene therapy, even on the sponsor side, even on the for-profit side, seems to be craving some of that collaborative modes. Yet, I mean, having lived in this world for 20 years, it barely happens. It barely happens on the academic side. It barely happens on the industry side. Do you believe more of this is needed outside of ultra-rare, maybe outside of manufacturing? And how do we accomplish this?
Yeah, I think we're going to need it throughout the industry and throughout government. I mean, from my perspective, as we hire up, we're going to be leaning in to think about people who are willing to think creatively. That's not to say that is not a disservice at all to those who are on staff right now. They are incredible and they are working incredibly hard. Okay, but I think we're going to need to try to leverage as many interesting new ideas internal to our organization at FDA. And I think that we're going to have to accept a lot of different thoughts and work through a lot of different ideas to find the best ideas. And the only way we'll get there is by sharing them.
Yeah.
Same way, I think, as we look outside of our government world, more sharing is going to be critical here. And I think we need to think about places where there can be more pre-competitive sharing. And it might be something where that pre-competitive sharing will actually ultimately float all boats.
Yeah.
Because I think that right now, for instance, there's been a lot of secrecy in the manufacturing area. Honestly, I actually don't think, I love manufacturing, don't get me wrong. That's what we could sit here and I would love to talk manufacturing all day long.
Yeah.
But for gene therapy, that's not where the innovation should really be super focused, right? We should have good manufacturing technology. It should be innovative, right?
Yep.
But the true value added that we should be having here as from the innovator should be in the novel gene therapy constructs and the diseases they're able to address. So I would be hoping that if we were able to get more conversations going and more work together, we'd be able to move to this next realm. I think that's why this field of gene therapy is a little bit stuck in a place where monoclonals moved relatively quickly to, I mean, it took them some time, but they moved into getting manufacturing down so that you had a lot of contract manufacturers that could make monoclonals. We're still not there with gene therapies, and I'd love to see us start to get over that hump so that instead of the focus being on how do I make, 80 or 90% full capsids and reduce my number of empty capsids through my secret way of doing so, either through production or purification, to how do I make the absolute best construct that could really cure a rare genetic disease as fastly as possible, permanently, with as few side effects.
Yeah. I mean, I want to build on the analogy you had there with the monoclonal space, which in the 90s kind of really bloomed and had a certain trajectory, right? And I think after the approvals of Luxturna, Zolgensma, some approvals in the CAR T cell space, I think many tried to overlay kind of that trajectory on our space. And we're now about half a decade or so after those pivotal approvals that really have shown the world that transformative results for patients can be had. But still somewhat remaining in a niche, right? These approvals still only address kind of smaller pockets. And certainly with the markets the way they are today, which you probably also are aware are particularly dire in the biotech, and in those cell and gene therapy even more so, right? And some may see that these individual stumbles, the clinical holds, the lack of new approvals coming, that they're somewhat emblematic of a field as a whole. What's your perspective on this, kind of on the industry as a whole? Are you more of a glass half full or a glass half empty on this? Is this an intrinsic problem with the technologies we're progressing? Or are we just going to have to be more patient with the technologies we have?
So a couple things. I'm a glass half full person here. I think the fact that we're bumping up against some issues says that we're actually doing our jobs, developing novel therapies that are pushing some of the limits, and we're learning some of those limits. I also think that we at FDA it's a learning curve for us. I think some of this is beginning to get a feel for things. I think we also are getting a feel for something. At least I will speak for myself. I have gotten to understand that how we are essentially we are participating in an ecosystem that's very fragile. We have to be careful about how we do our jobs here. We have to be very thoughtful when we take actions. I think from my perspective, I'm committed to having more dialogue to try to reduce actions that tend to send chills down the spine of the entire industry, because I think every one of the actions that we take, I know that is an adverse action, ends up having ripple effects far from where we start. I actually, as a sailor, I can tell you, I actually think the wave effect in this is a great analogy, because I see the ripples, as far as I can possibly see sometimes. So very aware of that and very committed to trying to address that. And I know, actually, oddly enough, from any number of conversations I've had over the past few weeks with both Commissioner Califf and our now Principal Deputy Commissioner, but the former Acting Commissioner, Janet Woodcock, how much I think we're committed to trying to really be thoughtful and careful about this as we move forward. That's not to say that we're not going to do our jobs and make sure that things are safe. That's what we have to do. Yeah. But I think if we were to hear the honest feedback from some, they would say, well, can we try to avoid problems before they start? Can you help us do our best to do that? And I think that's what we have to do.
Well, Dr. Marks, we're running short on time here, but as we predicted, we haven't been able to get through even half of the agenda we had considered talking about here. We're fortunate because I think you'll be back tomorrow, and you're extremely generous with your time. So I do want to thank you for participating in the forum again. And I also want to extend our gratitude to the agency as a whole for the efforts in a time where really biomedicine and regulatory sciences have never been more important. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Marks, for attending.
Thank you so much. Great pleasure.